It's time. You ready to geek out? It's Weather for Weather Geeks time. Wednesday evening edition here in the middle of the work week, in the middle of a pretty remarkable stretch of mid-winter weather. We've been on a winter hiatus now for a couple of weeks. When we look back at high temperatures so far in February, of course, every day has been warmer than the average, and today, the warmest day of the bunch. Just getting started, though, because tomorrow and Friday and Saturday will be even warmer than today. And when you factor in highs and lows, we're running about 9 degrees above average through the first 7 days of the month. I think when we're done with this stretch, at the end of the day on Saturday, this will probably go into the record books as the warmest first 10 days of February on record for our region. But of course, the warm-up began before February began. We've been mild now for going on a couple of weeks. Remember back at the end of January how the pattern flipped? We went from that pretty cold stretch in the middle of the month to a very balmy end to January, 61 back on January 26th. And we've been above the average every single day since, even though on the 29th we were only 1 degree above the average. But yeah, what a stretch we're in the middle of. And, this was a little bit, kind of semi-unexpected as far as the timing of this stretch of warm weather. When we put out our initial winter forecast in early November, we talked about February being the month in which cold would be most concentrated. And I still think the back half of February is going to be pretty cold, and I think March is going to end up being pretty cold as well. But the first 10 days of February is 1/3 of the month, or even a little more than 1/3 of the month, and that's going to really change the final numbers when all is said and done, despite how cold it's going to get. And when we talk about averages in the weather department, whether we're talking about rain, snow, wind, temperatures, anything, it's based on 30-year periods. And we're now using 1991 to 2020 as our 30-year block that we base our averages off of. These update at the beginning of every decade. So in 2031, we'll go from 2000 to 2030 as our 30-year period. And so, of course, our old period was 81 to 2010, and when we started using these new averages a few years ago, the average temperatures, both highs and lows, went up just about every month, with a couple of exceptions. In fact, this month is one of our exceptions. The low temperatures didn't really rise in the new 30-year averages compared to the old one. The high temperatures in February have risen, but the low temperatures did not. But, everything's relative, and relative to the average, it was a pretty remarkable day today, and even more so tomorrow. We'll talk about perhaps challenging or breaking a record tomorrow afternoon. In the meantime, all the wet weather out west. This is a look at the rainfall over the last 7 days. Now, this is all precipitation, so in the highest terrain in the mountains, a lot of this fell with snow, but wanted to zoom in particular. Let's go back to that. Wanted to zoom in particular on the Los Angeles area and show you just how ridiculous the rainfall totals have been. And they're not quite done with it just yet, but there's been parts of the LA basin. Once you get into some of these purple colors, on our color scheme up here, that's double-digit rainfall totals just in the last 7 days. Now, some years you might not see double-digit rainfall totals for the entire year in parts of Southern California, especially in the areas away from the immediate coast. But still, this is really, really impressive, and of course, it's been very, very problematic. Their weather will stay a little bit active in the near term, but then it's going to start to settle down as some of the action starts shifting to the east. We're already starting to see a little bit of evidence of the pattern change with now low pressure across the northern plains and starting to see some showers breaking out on the southern end of this. If this were later in the season, especially as we get into mid-spring, this would be a pretty good severe weather setup. And even though we're in February, we are going to be talking about a low-end chance of some heavy gusty storms tomorrow around northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin in the dead of winter. Low-end 1 on the 1 to 5 scale risk of severe weather tomorrow afternoon. For us, though, that's not the concern. We're going to be high and dry through Thursday. In fact, the record high is low-hanging fruit tomorrow. Records at this time of the year are mostly in the 60s to around 70. But our record tomorrow is, as I mentioned, it's within reach. It's 58 set 5 years ago in 2019. I think we'll give that a run for its money tomorrow afternoon, maybe even break it. If we don't hit 58 tomorrow, we've got a pretty good chance of doing so on Friday. Like a shower tomorrow night, but we've removed rain chances from our Friday forecast. This will be a breezy and dry day with some sunshine as well. What a great afternoon we have coming up on Friday. As far as the weekend goes, it's not a washout Saturday, but here's our first kind of significant cold front that we've had in a little while now. This will not send us into the deep freeze or anything, but it will put an end to the ridiculous April-like warmth. And this will also squeeze out some showers on Saturday. Again, not a washout, but showers can come and go. We're going to start talking more and more about early next week because, this is kind of an interesting setup. The transition from the ridiculously mild pattern to a colder, more seasonable pattern could be a little bit bumpy. A lot of times these big pattern shifts are bumpy, either coming out of the cold or going into the cold. Usually there's a storm involved. And while today's only Wednesday, and for us, this is mostly a Monday night concern, we're a long ways off, we're going to start talking about this in a little more detail here. And this is kind of my first map I put out today showing the areas where some snow is fairly likely and then the heaviest snow is fairly likely with this early week system. I think this will be a decent snow producer for places like Buffalo, Rochester, the Finger Lakes, maybe down to I-80 in parts of central and northern PA, and then certainly into interior New England where it's not been a very snowy season at all. For us, it's a much more questionable proposition. It's all about the storm track. A track that, you know how this works. If it goes far enough to the west, it's going to drag in enough warm air that, they might get snow out here, but we don't see much around here. But a little jog to the east, and we would be, in a more favorable position for some snow. So let's show you some raw model data this evening, and, we're just going to kind of briefly go through this. Here's a look at what we call the GFS ensemble. So in other words, there are dozens of flavors of the GFS model run over and over again with slightly initial conditions baked into the model, and then you get different outcomes based on those initial conditions, and then you kind of throw them all together and form a mean or an average. And what we're looking at here is the odds of 3 inches or more worth of snow based on this afternoon's run of the GFS ensemble. For Northeast Ohio and Northwest PA, we're probably looking at something like something between 30 and 50% odds of more than 3 inches. That's the GFS ensemble. The European ensemble looks like this. Odds reasonably similar to the GFS ensemble. They're pretty modest here locally. Right now, the current odds, I'd put them somewhere between 20 and 40% based on the European ensemble of more than 3 inches. Again, this is 3 inches or more. That's our threshold we're using on this. I think some snow is fairly likely, I think, later Monday into Monday night. Whether we get more than an inch and maybe up towards more enough to shovel and plow, 3 inches or more, that's much more questionable at this point. And again, this is mostly a Monday night deal, so we're a long ways off from being able to figure this out. But I wanted to show you on the Weather Geeks video this evening some geeky stuff that I look at behind the scenes when I'm trying to ascertain exactly what kind of flavor of a storm could we have early next week. Overall, though, despite that chance for some snow early next week, this is not a particularly stormy-looking pattern. The cold air makes inroads, but I think the storm track is going to be largely to our south over the next couple of weeks. Occasionally we're going to get some precipitation and maybe have some snow chances, but it doesn't look like we'll be dealing with a gravy train of storms this far to the north and west in the initial phases of this colder pattern. I think this cold's going to stick around for a while. Looking at the longer range, the longer range modeling is pretty cold looking for a fair amount of March, which we will dive into in more detail as we get deeper into this month of February. Thanks for watching Weather for Weather Geeks on this Wednesday evening. I'll see you right back here on Thursday.